educator evaluation. I'd like to take a moment to extend a sincere and heartfelt apology to everybody for the technical failures of our live webinar on February 24th. We understand that folks took time out of their busy days to attend and sincerely regret the inconvenience. We'll be evaluating our processes for delivering live webinars in the future. That said, I hope that today's webinar will be valuable to special educators and evaluators alike. Rather than set goals for the webinar, I'd like to just frame the following guiding questions that we will try to address. 1, how can the educator evaluation framework support improved services and instruction for students with special education eligibilities? 2, how can the educator evaluation framework support the professional growth of special education personnel? And 3, how can the educator evaluation framework support inclusive educational models for schools and districts? ESE is in a continuous process of outreach about the implementation of the educator evaluation framework. The following are some common concerns that we have heard regarding the evaluation of special education personnel. 1, are all evaluators knowledgeable about research-based best practices for students with disabilities? Are the unique job responsibilities of special educators accurately captured by the ESE model rubrics? And finally, are the unique job responsibilities of special educators educator evaluation? My name is Matt Holloway. I'd like to take a moment to extend a sincere and heartfelt apology to everybody for the technical failures of our live webinar on February 24th. We understand that folks took time out of their busy days to attend and sincerely regret the inconvenience. We will be evaluating our processes for delivering live webinars in the future. That said, I hope that today's webinar will be valuable to special educators and evaluators alike. Rather than set goals for this webinar, I'd like to just frame the following guiding questions that we will try to address. How can the educator evaluation framework support improved services and instruction for students with special education eligibilities? How can the educator evaluation framework support the professional growth of special education personnel? And how can the educator evaluation framework support inclusive educational models for schools and districts? ESE is in a continuous process of outreach about the implementation of the educator evaluation framework. The following are some common concerns that we've heard regarding the evaluation of special education personnel. Are all evaluators knowledgeable about research-based best practices for students with disabilities? Are the unique job responsibilities of special educators accurately captured by the ESE model rubrics? Will students with special education eligibilities have lower growth scores that disproportionately affect student impact ratings? It's the goal of this webinar to address these concerns and hopefully shine some light on best practices that we've heard from districts as well. The webinar will follow the structure of the EdEval framework itself. We'll start by addressing aspects of the summative performance rating, pause to highlight some resources, continue on to the student impact rating, review some more resources, and share some closing thoughts. We just want to begin with a glance at the overall educator evaluation framework and show the two independent but linked ratings. The ratings should be determined independently, and the points of intersection have to do with the determination of the educator's plan. We'll start with the summative performance rating and the pieces that go into that. We know this framework can be complex, especially if you're somewhat new to the system, so I'd like to start our conversation around the criteria that go into the summative performance rating, the rubrics and educator goal attainment. Ratings across the 4 standards and an assessment of whether educators have met their goals is where we're going to start. The tools to assess those ratings and those goals will be the 3 categories of evidence: products of practice, multiple measures of student learning, and student and staff feedback. It's only when that evidence has been analyzed across the rubric and for goal attainment that an evaluator can determine a summative performance rating. The application of professional judgment is an important aspect of this process as well, and we will discuss that as well. Also note that educators must be rated at least proficient in standards 1 and 2 to have a proficient overall rating. These are the so-called minimum thresholds. So let's move on to the summative performance rating itself, starting with the rubrics. The appropriate rubric for special education teachers is the teacher rubric. However, districts have expressed the need for customization options. So we're going to discuss 3 approaches to customizing the rubric to meet the needs of educators with unique job responsibilities: prioritizing indicators and elements, developing role-specific resources, and creating a hybrid rubric. So let's begin with prioritizing indicators and elements. prioritizing indicators. So, consider the extent to which the use of existing rubrics can be customized through a differentiated emphasis and prioritization of indicators and elements. This is commonly done district-wide. For example, many districts have identified power elements to align with specific district priorities like explicit instruction or higher order questioning, but it can also be a tool for educators in differentiated roles. For example, districts have shared that the following are areas of priority for special educators. So that would be element 2A3, meeting diverse needs, 2B2, the collaborative learning environment, 2C1, respecting differences, and the indicator 2D, expectations. Of course, all educators are assessed according to the full appropriate rubric, but prioritized aspects of that rubric may help evaluators focus in on district and individual educator priorities. So next, let's take a look at some role-specific resources. In order to address the need for more specificity, some professional organizations have developed role-specific resources that could be added to the model rubrics, which can be accessed on the EdEval site, and we'll share a link for that shortly. Special education directors have reported preparing similar resources for other district evaluators. For example, look for documents for principals who are evaluating special education teachers in substantially separate settings, or assistant principals who are observing special educators supporting inclusive placements. Finally, we have commonly heard of districts who are hybridizing or combining rubrics where appropriate. Some educators may be in a role that combines the responsibilities of both a classroom teacher and an administrator, such as a department head. Others may be in roles that combine the responsibilities of classroom teachers and CISP educators. In this scenario, the parties could create a hybrid rubric, including standards, indicators, and elements, or descriptors from multiple rubrics appropriate to the responsibilities of the educator. So those are some options for customizing the rubric for special educators. One final note about rubrics, they're not the same thing as a walkthrough form. It's just not feasible to see all of the elements on the rubric, or even all of the elements on standards 1 and 2 in a single classroom visit. The rubrics are written to support educators and evaluators in making judgments about patterns of evidence gathered across multiple points in time. The tools for classroom visits should allow for more flexibility for the observer and to facilitate the delivery of targeted, meaningful feedback to educators. So now let's transition to the other criteria by which evaluators analyze evidence, educator goals. This is an area where special educators have a vast body of wisdom and knowledge about already, of course. Each educator has two goals in the educator evaluation framework. A student learning goal, where they focus on the needs of the students. What's the greatest area of need for support? How can you meet the unique needs of your students? Note that ESE does not suggest aligning these goals directly with IEP goals. And the professional practice goal, focusing on professional growth opportunities. What do you as an educator want to get better at or learn more about? Some districts have described the use of shared goals as a way to encourage collaboration between general education and special education teachers in inclusion settings. This approach should be balanced with the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities. But it's a great example of our first guiding question of how the EdEval framework can be used to support improved services and instruction for students with special education eligibilities. So now let's turn to the evidence by which an evaluator is making these determinations. There are three categories of evidence: products of practice, multiple measures of student learning, and other evidence, including feedback. All three categories of evidence should yield information about the educator's practice related to the 4 standards of the rubric and/or the educator's goals. Before we get into the specific categories, a note about the collection of evidence in general and products of practice in particular. There is no maximum or minimum requirement associated with the provision of evidence. There needs to be enough evidence associated with each standard such that the rating on that standard can be supported. The body of evidence should be aligned to the individual educator's goals, the focus of the evaluation, and school or district priorities. Okay, so let's start with products of practice, which include both artifacts related to educator practice and observations of practice. Artifacts tend to be what people most generally refer to as evidence, although it's important to remember that that evidence in the Mass EdEval framework is much broader than that. Educators and evaluators should think strategically about evidence collection, keeping in mind that one piece of evidence often reflects practice associated with multiple standards and indicators. While the majority of special education teachers in Mass are evaluated by school-level administrators, the artifacts of their practice will often be very specific to the special education process. So this is a chance for educators and evaluators to connect and share in professional learning. In some districts, school administrators collaborate with special education administrators to calibrate their evaluation practices. A few best practices that we've heard from districts include educators and evaluators agreeing on artifacts of practice in advance. Special educators with significant case management responsibilities using sample student folders as artifacts of practice. And then special education artifacts can be an opportunity to start conversations about specially designed instruction that meets the unique needs of students with disabilities. Okay, so moving on to observations, which, while still a very crucial part of the framework, are only one type of evidence. Evaluators need multiple opportunities and settings to observe and assess educator practice. Multiple observations paired with timely feedback are a key part of a strong evaluation system. And special educators perform vital work in a variety of settings. And you know, this last point is a really important one to bring home, particularly with evaluators who don't have a lot of special education experience. Another category of evidence includes multiple measures of student learning. In contrast to the measures that inform the student impact rating, which must be comparable across grade or subject level district-wide, these measures may include classroom-specific assessments that provide evidence of practice related to the standards or goal attainment. So, for example, data pertaining to student-specific interventions would be appropriate here. So finally, this is the first year that student staff feedback are a mandatory part of the evaluation process. The regulations do not specify what aspect of the evaluation framework need to be informed by feedback, nor the kind of feedback that must be collected. But the third category of evidence must include feedback from students and staff, or staff. Other sources of information, such as evidence of fulfillment of professional responsibilities and evidence of family engagement, may also be considered. Collecting feedback, this is important to note here, collecting feedback from students with special needs is a valuable part of the evaluation process. Districts should make every effort to include all students or a representative sample of all students in their feedback collection. This is an especially important and resonant point for special educators, since ensuring that all students have a voice is reflective of the general approach of special education. Districts have indicated a need for supports around collecting feedback from students with significant cognitive disabilities. And so ESE is in the process of gathering stakeholder input on that process, and is developing resources. And guidance will be published in May to support implementation in 2015 and 16. So we've looked at the criteria for the summative performance rating and the evidence that informs that criteria. Now let's talk for a moment about the final step before a rating is determined, the application of professional judgment. The two key factors here, especially for special educators, are transparency and collaboration. This should be a transparent process between evaluators and educators, no surprises. And there should be collaboration with special education administrators wherever appropriate. So the following resources will help in understanding the summative performance rating. You can access the links directly by downloading the PDF or PowerPoint versions of this webinar you see below the screen here. So we're going to transition now to the student impact rating. You'll see that as written in regulation, the rating must include 2 or more years of evidence and 2 or more measures of student learning, growth, or achievement. Similar to the summative performance rating, an evaluator's professional judgment plays a key role here as well. Let's take a moment to look at the regulatory language around this. So some key definitions from regulation. The student impact rating, it says, the evaluator shall determine whether an educator is having a high, moderate, or low impact on student learning based on trends of at least 2 years and patterns of at least 2 measures. The student growth percentile. For some educators, measures of growth on statewide assessments are a required part of the process of determining student impact. And the definition of district-determined measures, DDMs are defined as measures of student learning, growth, and achievement related to the Massachusetts Curriculum Frameworks, Massachusetts Vocational Technical Educational Frameworks, or other relevant frameworks that are comparable across grade or subject level district-wide. When the regulations refer to patterns and trends, they mean the results from at least 2 different measures of student learning, growth, and achievement, and trends over at least 2 years. A note on SGP. So while students with disabilities often demonstrate high growth compared to other groups, students with disabilities have a lower average SGP. As a result, educators working primarily with SWDs may be more likely to meet the definition of low growth set by ESE than to attain moderate or high growth. This is one reason why professional judgment is such a critical part of the process of determining an educator's student impact rating. And a note about professional judgment. So when determining high, moderate, or low impact ratings for educators, evaluators are encouraged to bear in mind an educator's student population, specific instructional context, and considerations related to the specific measure or a combination of measures when determining those student impact ratings. So having addressed SGP, let's turn to DDMs. The best resource on this will be the DDM implementation brief called Considerations for Special Education. There will be a link to it in a moment, but this document really does unpack a lot of the challenges and opportunities inherent in special educator evaluation. As folks know, DDMs are measures of student learning growth and achievement. The two most important messages for any educator in any role are that DDMs be aligned to instructional content and yield meaningful information for educators. DDMs have really built a lot of assessment knowledge among Massachusetts educators. I think it's safe to say that our educators are some of the most assessment literate in the world at this point. And this applies especially to special educators, many of whom are already fluent in the concepts of universally designed assessment. As a part of the continuous improvement process, districts will want to review for and identify barriers in assessments that interfere with students' ability to demonstrate their knowledge. So does the assessment item require skills beyond the content being assessed? For example, math items that require reading comprehension skills beyond the intent of the assessment, or science items that require culturally specific background knowledge. Those are some questions you could ask about assessment items. Other key messages about DDMs for special educators include using or modifying existing measures. Special educators gather a lot of data already. What would it take to use that data in the DDM process? A district-wide message about professional judgment, and slide 34 from this show may be helpful there. Differentiating between growth and achievement. Many concerns about DDMs come from the misunderstanding that we're measuring student achievement only. Most educators understand this already, but it's important to make the distinction clear. All students should have an equal chance to demonstrate growth, so our assessments need to be designed with this in mind. And making clear connections between baseline scores and parameters for growth, bands or banding. So let's explore this banding concept a little bit more. Banding addresses the common concern. Do all students have to meet the same score in assessment to demonstrate moderate growth? The answer, of course, is no. Student growth levels should be aligned to baseline data. So some districts have set parameters for low, moderate, or high growth differently according to baseline scores. 3 bands could be set corresponding to baseline data with different parameters for growth attached to each. Bands do a lot to address the problem of measuring differential growth. This is an example of a banded assessment. Notice that the cut score for moderate growth varies based on the baseline score, the start of course score on the left. Many districts report banding as a useful tool for differentiating growth on DDMs. Okay, so speaking of highly differentiated assessments, we are now going to consider the MCAS alternate assessment. MCAS Alt does not generate SGP scores and is not a required aspect of the educator evaluation regulations. A significant percentage of districts, however, have indicated that they're using or are planning to use the MCAS Alt as a DDM. So ESE has been gathering stakeholder input on this process as well and is developing resources. Guidance will be published in May to support implementation in 2015-2016. The following key considerations will be unpacked in greater detail in the guidance this spring, but for now, some key considerations. Using measurable outcomes as growth measures, not the overall score of the MCAS Alt. Calibrating your measurable outcomes. So since this assessment is not comparable across students, we recommend that districts calibrate these among teams of educators. Setting a range for moderate growth. Moderate growth should be a range, not a single point. So those are some early thoughts about MCAS Alt, about using the MCAS Alt as a DDM. More information to come about this in the spring. If you are using the MCAS Alt as a DDM currently, don't worry. Follow your district's processes as laid out, and remember that ESE will be giving guidance around this, but specific decisions about DDMs are left to the discretion of the district. Okay, so from one somewhat controversial topic to another, let's talk about using IEP goals in the DDM process. Districts may find that IEP goals provide a meaningful starting point for DDMs, but it's definitely important to make a distinction between the assessment purpose of each. The following are some of the challenges in using IEP goals as DDMs. We have variations in IEP timelines. IEP goals are designed to be dichotomous, that is either met or not met. DDMs require 3 levels, high, moderate, and low. IEP goals are developed with the expectation that they will be met. In contrast, determinations of high, moderate, and low growth are designed to describe a range of growth without a predetermined expectation. Educators may not be responsible for a certain IEP goal. For example, a reading supports teacher is not responsible for a goal supported by an occupational therapist. IEP goals are not designed to be comparable across students. IEP goals must meet specific legal requirements, including parental involvement, that may not be consistent with the process of determining goals of a DDM. So for these reasons and more, we advise extreme caution around using IEPs as DDMs, remembering that this final decision still remains in the hands of the districts. So often people ask why guidance around DDMs is not more specific. And I'd like to share the following example of 2 districts as an answer to that. So this is a comparison of 2 actual districts, both of whom want to use the DDM process as a way to promote inclusive classrooms. In District A, all the teachers are using general education DDMs to encourage co-teaching and collaborative approaches to inclusion. In District B, special educators are using DDMs tied to access and independence measures based on specially designed instruction for individual students. Both of these approach inclusion thoughtfully and strategically. They share the same why, but because of district-specific considerations, they have each addressed the how in their own way. And this is the kind of autonomy the districts are allowed to retain in the DDM process. Another group that's the subject of frequent questions are SISP educators, Specialized Instructional Support Personnel. The following guidance comes from the DDM implementation brief called Indirect Measures and SISP Educators. This table gives you a feel for the concept of indirect measures. On top, you can see that a direct measure aligns to classroom instruction, which is aligned to a set curriculum. But many educators in supporting roles provide supports that are specialized and don't align to set curriculum. For these educators, districts may prefer to use indirect measures of student growth. For those who are looking for guidance and examples for those educators, I would strongly encourage you to access the implementation brief document, which contains examples applicable to a range of SISP educators, including counselors, school psychologists, school nurses, and more. Finally, ESE has revised its guidance around DDMs for administrators to include example measures for special education administrators. These measures come from district submissions, and the examples were generated with the help of the Association of Special Education Administrators. The measures include progress of specific student populations on common assessments, closing achievement gap for specific student populations, and then a number of indirect measures, removal rates, parent satisfaction surveys, measures to address disproportionate identification and placement, special education timelines, coordinated program reviews, measures of placement in least restrictive environment. So this wide range of measures that districts have reported using for special education administrators reflects the way that DDMs can reflect the broad range of priorities that various districts have. Following resources will all be helpful in developing and supporting the student impact rating. Also, please note that ESE has now created a web page specific to special educator effectiveness. This page is designed to be a resource for those involved with the process of special educator evaluation, although all the resources are also available in other places on the educator evaluation site. Hopefully, we've addressed some of our guiding questions and given you tools to work with. We know that this is only a small part of the amazing work you do every day with the students in your district, and we are humbled and grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with such a thoughtful and dedicated group of educators. ESE is committed to preserving an ongoing dialogue with districts around the effective support of all students in Massachusetts. Please don't hesitate to call or email with questions or comments about the contents of this webinar or any other issue pertaining to educator evaluation.